Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event entitled What the Allies Knew About the Holocaust. It's the second event in the series accompanying the exhibition The Holocaust, What Did the Germans Know? And if you're interested in the series, you can find more information on our website and also in our flyer, which you can find just outside this room. And a brief note, the third event in the series will take place on June 23rd and will focus on everyday communication in Nazi Germany. But to come back to the exhibition, it explores what people in Germany knew about the mass murder of European Jews during the Second World War. It looks first at what the Nazi regime wanted the population to know, and then at the informal information circulating in society. So that means it looks at rumors, hints, and indications. And finally, it shows how individuals linked such information together and got a relatively accurate idea of the mass crimes. And if you hadn't had the chance to see the exhibition, it will still be on display until the end of January 2027, so you still have a few months to do so. It's an exhibition on Germany and the German population, so you may wonder, why should we actually look at the knowledge of the Allies? Or in other words, where is the connection to this topic? And one answer can actually be found in the exhibition itself. In the second part, you will see reproductions of Allied leaflets that were dropped over Germany in their millions. And these leaflets contained information about, well, a lot of different things, but also about deportations and mass murder. And they became, in fact, an important source of information for people inside Germany. And this, of course, then raises questions. What did the Allies actually know? How did they obtain their information? And what did they do with it? To explore these questions, I'm very pleased to welcome Elizabeth Harvey and Michael Fleming tonight. Elizabeth Harvey will be moderating tonight's discussion and will introduce tonight's speaker as well, so I'm not going to do that now. But I will introduce Liz, even though most people here will be familiar with her and most people are familiar with her work. She is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Nottingham, and until 2025 she was the project lead for the English language edition, The Persecution and Murder of the European Jews by Nazi Germany. And I would also like to point out that she served on the advisory board of our exhibition. So again, thanks a lot for, or great thanks to you for all the thought, for all the energy and time you put into this project. And so yes, it's just an honor to have you here tonight, Liz, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, for those very kind words. My job tonight is to introduce Michael Fleming and then to chair the discussion. Just to give you as an overview, Michael Fleming will speak for around 30 minutes, and after that he and I will have an exchange, question and answer on the platform, and then at about 8:10 it'll be open, the floor will be open so that you can ask your questions, and very much hope that you will ask questions. Please feel free to ask your questions in English or in German. I'll do my best to translate the questions from German into English if that's your preference. Anyway, so I'm very pleased to see so many people here tonight, and I'm delighted to introduce Michael Fleming, who is a real expert on this topic, what the Allies knew, with a particular focus on the Western Allied governments, Britain and the United States. Michael Fleming is professor at the Polish University Abroad in London, and he's published very widely on how news of the Holocaust was transmitted to Western governments during the war, and what those governments did and did not do with that knowledge. He's a particular expert on the role of, on the one hand, the Polish underground, the operating in occupied Poland, and the Polish government in exile, based in London, and the connections between the Polish underground and the Polish government in exile. So he's done an amazing study of the gathering and transmitting of evidence on the murder of the Polish Jews during the war. And along with numerous articles on the topic, he's published a book on this called Auschwitz, the Allies, and the Censorship of the Holocaust. And that appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2014. Since then, he's published another book, this time on the Polish role in the judicial pursuit of Nazi war crimes. And his latest book came out in 2022, is entitled In the Shadow of the Holocaust, Poland, the United War Crimes Commission, and the Search for Justice. And some of the work that he did on that topic will also be part of his presentation today. So, with that, I'm very pleased to hand over to Michael Fleming and look forward to your responses later on.
Good evening, everybody. Liz, thank you very much for a very kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to this wonderful museum. I'm delighted to be here. Let's get started, I guess. Okay, we'll start at this point. On 8th of December 1942, President Roosevelt received a delegation of Jewish representatives at the White House. During the 29-minute meeting, the delegates handed him a memorandum which detailed Germany's policy of systematically killing Jews. This document referred to the killing of Jews at Helmnau and also stated, I quote, the slaughter of trainloads of Jewish adults and children in great crematoriums at Oświęcim near Krakow is confirmed by eyewitnesses in reports which recently reached Jerusalem. Despite the clarity of this document, much scholarship and public history over the last 40 years has argued that the Allies had only partial knowledge of the Holocaust as it was unfolding. Nowhere is this narrative seen more clearly than in a myth popularized by the historian Martin Gilbert that the true function of Auschwitz was unknown until the arrival of the Weber-Wetzler report in the West in the summer of 1944. This myth has had such traction that despite decades of corrective scholarship, a TV production screened on the BBC in 2019, titled 1944, Should We Bomb Auschwitz?, following Gilbert, contended that the mass murder of Jews at Auschwitz was unknown until the summer of 1944. This document from late 1942 is one of dozens that reported on the killing of Jews at Auschwitz prior to June 1944. In what follows, I will explore what was known, when, by whom, how it was known, and how information about the Holocaust was responded to. If we conceptualize the Holocaust as an incremental process incorporating identification, isolation, deportation, ghettoization, and destruction, we can identify 4 periods in the knowledge of the Holocaust. The early stages of Germany's war on Jews commenced with the ascent of the Nazi Party. Jews were identified through, inter alia, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, and increasingly marginalized. This process was reported in real time by a range of journalists and diplomats based in Germany. Germany's anti-Jewish legislation was widely reported. The second period starts with the German invasion of Poland. At this point, knowledge in the West about Germany's actions did not always mirror what was happening on the ground. Consequently, the Polish government in exile released its first black book in French in April 1940. An English translation was published in August. However, German actions against Jews specifically tended to be subsumed in the general narrative of German violence and violations of international law. The third period commences with the German invasion of Soviet-occupied Poland and the Soviet Union in June 1941. This period saw the commencement of the Holocaust by bullets, whereby Jews were killed en masse by invading Germans, generally by being shot. It is at this point a significant disconnect appears between what was happening on the ground and what was known to different constituencies in the West. We will explore this period shortly. The final period, which is the general focus of debates on Allied knowledge of the Holocaust, concerns what the Allies knew about the death camps, the systematic murder of European Jews through the use of gas at various sites in German-occupied Poland. The killing operation commenced at Helmno in December 1941, and the camps at Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Majdanek began their mass killing, gassing, in 1942. With this periodization in mind, let's turn to the question of sources of information and who had access to particular information. In the first period, information on German anti-Jewish policy was open. German legislation and speeches by Nazi leaders were reported in the press. All constituencies, diplomats, politicians, civil society activists, the general public in the West could have access to the information via the press and the BBC. In the second period, details about specific anti-Jewish actions became less accessible, but those concerned could still learn that German policy against Jews was harsher than against other groups, with reports of German actions delivered to the West by refugees, American journalists, and via couriers and radio transmissions sent by the Polish underground state. In the third period, information about German actions was initially received in Britain via radio intercepts, and early news of the Holocaust by Bollocks was generally restricted to intelligence officials based at Bletchley Park and senior politicians. Churchill learned that the Germans were systematically killing Jews in midsummer 1941. His 24th August 1941 broadcast, referring to scores of thousands of executions against Russian patriots, doesn't actually mention Jews. Despite this, this speech has been seen by Martin Gilbert as referring to the Holocaust. It is almost certain that Churchill knew about the systematic shooting of Jews by 24th of August, but his broadcast that day would not have relayed that knowledge to the general public. Over the course of late 1941 and early 1942, some reports of German actions against Jews were reported by journalists. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency on 16th of November 1941 reported on the massacre in Kiev, Babi Yar. German policy was clearly understood by various British officials by early 1942. On 22nd of January 1942, for example, a British Postal and Telegraph censorship report noted that the Germans were clearly pursuing a policy of extermination against Jews. In the fourth period, information about the death camps was received in the summer of 1942 and continuously through 1943 and 1944. It was sent in the main by the Polish underground state, via courier and via radio. The gathering and sending of information was structured and regular, and on receipt in London was processed in the first instance by the Polish Ministry of the Interior. It was then distributed in a variety of ways. As we receive reports of the destruction of European Jewry did not always align with how the major allies sought to narrate the war, and were received with various degrees of resistance by officials in the Foreign Office due to concerns about domestic anti-Semitism and foreign policy objectives, such as maintaining influence and stability in the Middle East. Consequently, information received in periods 3 and 4, that is from the summer of 1941, was not available to all constituencies in a timely fashion, and the raw data was subjected to framing and interpretations by powerful actors, such as the Foreign Office. Furthermore, the circulation of information to the general public in Britain, as we shall see, was restricted by newspaper editors, who were advised by the Foreign Office. Through the autumn of 1941, the governments of the minor allies based in London worked to ensure German war crimes in occupied Europe would be prosecuted. To this end, the minor allies held a conference at St. James's Palace on the punishment of war crimes on the 13th of January 1942. At the same time, the Polish government in exile published its second black book, which provided graphic details of German actions in occupied Poland, including those against Jews. The book noted anti-Jewish regulations, ghettoization, deportation, and the murder of Jews. Unknown to the Allies in January 1942, the gassing of Jews at Helmno proceeded apace. The news of Helmno arrived in London in late May 1942 in a report compiled by the Bund and smuggled out of Poland via one of the Polish underground's clandestine channels, in this case via the Swedish businessman Sven Norman. In late June 1942, information from the Bund report was published in the Daily Telegraph and broadcast on the BBC. At the beginning of July 1942, further information about the camps was published. The Polish Fortnightly Review noted the gassing of Jews at Belzec and Sobibor. And on 9th July 1942, a conference was held at the Ministry of Information that noted the killing of Jews at different camps. The speeches from that conference were published in August 1942 in a booklet titled Bestiality Unknown in Any Previous Record of History. But it's important to note that there was no diplomatic note or convening of a high-level intergovernmental meeting following the receipt of the first news of the death camps. Indeed, in August 1942, the British Foreign Office worked hard to downplay the information received. The Foreign Office delayed the distribution of the Rhiner telegram, which indicated a plan to exterminate Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany, and also persuaded the Liberal MP, Geoffrey Mander, to withdraw a parliamentary question on Helmno. Consequently, news of the Holocaust was marginalised in the war narrative, despite the efforts of the Bundesschmuel Ziegelboim, who, working with Liberty Publications, published Stop Them Now in September 1942, and the International Secretary of the Labour Party, William Gillis, who was instrumental in organising the Labour Party's one and only conference protesting against German atrocities. It was not until November 1942 that the Holocaust returned to the inside pages of newspapers. In the US, in late November, the State Department confirmed Germany had killed Jews in an extermination campaign. Earlier, in London on the 13th of November, the Polish government received a tranche of documents from the Polish underground state via courier. The documents include information about the deportations from Warsaw and about the camps, including Auschwitz. It is worth noting here, as the historian Adam Pawłowski has clearly shown, that the two-page document which was passed to the Foreign Office on the 24th of November 1942, reporting on the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto and deportations to Sobibor, Belzec and Treblinka, and that has been labelled the Karski Report and continues to have that label at the National Archives in Kew, had nothing to do with Jan Karski. He did not write it, he did not courier it. The original source was written by Henryk Wolinski, Stanisław Herbst and Ludwig Wiederschael, was sent from Warsaw via the Budapest route and was received in London on the 13th of November, prior to Karski's arrival in Britain. Karski did carry the well-known protest by the Catholic writer Zofia Kossak, which has already been received in Rome in September 1942, and the reports of various Polish political parties, including the Bund. With the latest information in hand, the Polish Foreign Ministry pushed for an official response and in early December submitted an official note to the Allies detailing Germany's programme of annihilating Jews. This note was instrumental in encouraging the Allies to issue the 17th December Declaration, which officially recognised Germany's policy of extermination. It is at this point we can say the Allies officially knew about the Holocaust, about deportation, starvation, ghettoization and death camps. And as we have seen, Roosevelt was informed about the slaughter of Jews at Auschwitz on 8th December 1942. A great deal of further news was shared with the major Allies about that camp through 1943 and 1944, little of which reached the general public in Britain. The 13th November tranche of documents from occupied Poland reignited the demands from the Polish government for retaliatory strikes against Germany and firmer commitments to bring to justice German war criminals. In early 1943, the Political Warfare Executive produced leaflets to inform Germans of German policy of mass murder, and these leaflets were dropped over German cities, including Berlin, in the first quarter of 1943. And this is just one example of them. But just like in the midsummer and autumn of 1942, following the UN Declaration of 7th December 1942, news of the Holocaust was once more marginalized. Report after report that circulated in intelligence circles, among journalists and various politicians about the killing of Jews at Auschwitz did not reach the general public. Only limited circulating newspapers published news of the mass killing, most notably the Polish Jewish Observer, a paper published in London's East End as a supplement to the City and East London Observer. This paper, however, was read by the Foreign Office's Poland specialist, Frank Savary, leading figures of British Jewry, including Adolf Brotman of the Board of Deputies, and it was edited by Joel Sang, who formerly wrote for major newspapers from Warsaw. For a clear example of how news of the destruction of European Jews was marginalized in Britain, we can look at the response to the important press release from the Polish government on Auschwitz that was issued in March 1944. No major British newspaper published the key information that more than 500,000 people, mostly Jews, had been gassed at Auschwitz. Various newspapers in both the United States and Australia published this information. The marginalization of this press release is significant given Germany's occupation of Hungary and the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz from April 1944. Given the true function of Auschwitz was known to key officials for over a year, the limited response to the initial deportations from Hungary cannot be adequately explained by reference to the build-up to D-Day. I now turn to the issue of how the Allies knew about German actions against Jews, and we use a couple of examples to illustrate how news of camps and ghettos reached London. I've already briefly touched on the May 1942 Bonn report. The writing and transit of this report is well understood. The information about Helmno came from an escapee, Schlamek Shlomo Weiner, who escaped Helmno on 19th of January 1941. By late January, early February, he reached Warsaw and provided Hirsch Wasser of Ogneg Shabbat with his testimony. Ogneg Shabbat passed the report on Helmno to the Home Army on the 23rd of March, and the Bund incorporated the information in a report sent via the Polish underground state's clandestine courier channel, in this case Sven Norman. Norman travelled and reached Stockholm. From there, it was sent to London, reaching the British capital in late May 1942. The information was then publicised in late June and early July in the press and on the BBC. News of the Great Deportation from Warsaw, which commenced on the 22nd of July 1942, was brought from Warsaw via the town of Oświęcim, that is Auschwitz, to Bern in Switzerland by Napoleon Segeda. The information that reached the West about the Warsaw Ghetto, including that sent onwards by Jewish activists in Switzerland in August 1942, was delivered to Switzerland by Segeda. Segeda was therefore one of the key couriers delivering news of the Holocaust, including about liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto and about Auschwitz. It is also worth noting that it was Segeda who wrote the 18th April 1943 report referred to by Martin Gilbert in his 1981 book, Auschwitz and the Allies. Gilbert does not indicate who the report was written for, but notes that it was written by a Pole, a non-Jew, and a member of the Polish underground, and state that it was never made public. Readers may assume that it was not made public by the Polish government in exile. In fact, it was written specifically for Ignacy Schwarzbart, one of the Jewish representatives on the Polish National Council. Schwarzbart circulated the report to Beryl Locker, chairman of the Jewish Agency in London, and to Rabbi Irving Miller. Further copies were sent to the British section of the World Jewish Congress and the Jewish Agency's Polish Jewish Department in Palestine and the World Jewish Congress in New York. Since it was sent abroad from London, it was intercepted by British censorship and was widely circulated among British intelligence and Foreign Office officials. Nearly all reports about the mass killing of Jews at Auschwitz that were received in the West were sent by the Polish underground state. These reports were sent via the regular courier post or the information was radioed from Warsaw. These reports often originated from information smuggled out of the camp by camp underground organizations, including the group associated with Witold Pilecki, and later, after Pilecki's escape from the camp in April 1943, from the socialist group of which Józef Sienkiewicz was a key part. This slide summarizes how an important report about the camp, stating that over 500,000 Jews had been killed in the camp, reached the West and was circulated. It was sent in multiple reports from Warsaw, and the main information was also radioed in a joint message signed by the head of the Home Army, Stefan Rowecki, and the head of the civilian branch, the delegate, which is a deputy prime minister position, Stanisław Jankowski, on the 4th of March 1943. The report reached the US Chief of Staff, and the key information was published in the Polish Jewish Observer. And here's just some examples of the places where the information, the core information actually was published over the course of 1943. This is an example of the Polish Jewish Observer, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. These two other publications are published by the consulate in Istanbul, the Polish consulate in Istanbul. The receipt of information about the unfolding Holocaust posed a challenge for how the Foreign Office sought to narrate the war. Given the possibility to stem the killing was not in the Allies' military gift in 1942, news of atrocities for the Foreign Office risked enhanced calls to divide viable resources to non-military tasks. Risked, it was thought, aggravating anti-Semitism and could create complications for Britain in the Middle East. For the Polish government in exile, news of atrocities often underpinned calls for retaliation and demands for post-war justice. At the same time, the Polish government, in line with the broader Allied policy, often subsumed the particular fate of Jews within a broader national narrative. On the other hand, Bundesschmuel Stiegelbaum worked tirelessly to focus attention on the fate of Polish Jewry. In May 1943, he committed suicide in protest against Allied inaction. But behind the scenes, movement towards post-war prosecution was gathering pace. In the US, Raphael Lemkin, generally using open source material, developed the idea of genocide. In London, intelligence reports on Germany's mass killing of Jews from Poland were being collated by the Polish War Crimes Office, and often underpinned indictments against German leaders, camp commandants and officials. In April 1944, the Polish War Crimes Office submitted a major charge file relating to Treblinka. And in June 1944, that is prior to the arrival of the Werber-Wetzler report, the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, was named an important charge file submitted to the United Nations War Crimes Commission. And this is this charge file. This file, which referred to Belzec, Chełmno, Sobibor, and Auschwitz, charged leading German figures with the murder of more than 1.5 million Polish Jews. And this is important because it names numerous German leaders and, as I've said, Commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss. Over the next year, further charge files were submitted to the United Nations War Crimes Commission by the Polish War Crimes Office. The material sent to London by the Polish underground state was ultimately used in post-war Poland in the prosecutions of German war crimes. And jurors such as Manfred Lachs and Tadeusz Cyprian, who played key roles in the War Crimes Office under the authority of the Polish government in exile, took up similar roles for the new government in Warsaw after the war. And I think this is important because of institutional knowledge, knowledge of the sources of information, and a familiarity with the news of the Holocaust as it was arriving in London. They've had essentially 2-3 years to digest this information and put it into a legal framework. And one of the most important things which they do within this legal framework is develop this notion of civil death. which is in the very major charge file from 1945, which charges, amongst others, Adolf Hitler. A very important charge file. To close, I would just like to underline a few points. First, information about the Holocaust was received continuously in the West. News of the death camps arrived in the summer of 1942. News of the killing of Jews at Auschwitz arrived in November 1942 and repeatedly through 1943 and 1944. The issue was not the lack of information, but the lack of response and the manner in which powerful actors, notably the Foreign Office, sought to frame the information and influence how others who had access to information understood the information that they had. It is also important to note that Auschwitz was well known to decision makers prior to the German occupation of Hungary. This raises uncomfortable questions about our response to the occupation and subsequent deportation of 500,000 Hungarian Jews to their deaths in the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael, for that really rich presentation. Raises a lot of questions. I'm going to ask some, and I'm sure you will have others to follow on with. But we've got now about half an hour or so or more to just the two of us to discuss here on the platform. So my first question relates to your third and fourth period that you referred to, and how knowledge in those two phases of the Holocaust got through to the West. You distinguish, I think it's important to distinguish maybe between what in the West was known about the mass shootings, the Holocaust by bullets from summer 1941 onwards in the occupied Soviet territories, and what they knew about the mass murder using gas in camps in occupied Poland. You do say that Churchill, I mean, you made that very clear, that Churchill was aware through the radio intercepts, through intelligence, of the mass executions of Jews taking place. He knew about this in August 1941. And you also made the point that he didn't relay the specific killing of Jews to the general public. He merely referred to the mass executions of Russian patriots. But you did also say that that knowledge about mass shootings was percolating through, partly through the press reports you mentioned, but also that it was becoming known amongst British officials. So maybe I'd like to know a little bit more specifically about the knowledge of that aspect of the Holocaust compared to the knowledge about the death camps, which the Polish underground was so instrumental in bringing to the West. And would it be true to say that it was the knowledge in the West about the death camps, the mass killings by gas, that triggered the Allied declaration of 17th of December 1942? It was that was in the forefront of awareness on the part of the Allies, rather than the massive deaths by shooting that had been taking place since summer 1941. Would that be accurate? Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Okay, let's start with 1941. In Britain, there was a particular policy about reporting atrocities, and reporting atrocities was discouraged with advice from the Foreign Office. BBC internal editorial policy discouraged the reporting of atrocities for both internal audiences and for external audiences, i.e. in continental Europe. Continental Europe, atrocities could be reported if it provoked a guilt reflex. In the UK itself, it was discouraged on the grounds that it could destabilize morale and actually bring focus onto Jews, which it was hypothesized would stimulate domestic anti-Semitism. The logic there is a bit fuzzy. I don't think anyone can really explain that particular logic. So what we have here, I mean, is the general reporting practices in the West, in Britain, the United States, obfuscated what was happening to Jews specifically. And indeed, the Holocaust, as there's a great scholar from the United States, Laurel Leff, she wrote this wonderful book maybe 20 years ago on the New York Times. And what she found in her magnificent study is that the Holocaust by bullets was probably the least reported aspect of the Holocaust. So in the United States paper of record, the New York Times, there were only about 16 reports about the Holocaust by bullets. By the same token, of course, news of this Holocaust by bullets was being published in the Jewish press, so it's being marginalized into the Jewish press. So we have a very interesting domestic dynamic in which Jewish populations could read what was happening in East and Central Europe after 1941. And we saw that in one of the slides I put up about the Jewish Telegraphic Agencies, a report on Baba Yar. Yet the mainstream press were simply marginalizing it and wasn't really there. So in terms of what was known to journalists, and this is interesting, the American journalists knew exactly what was happening, being based in Germany, and there's a Chicago Tribune reporter quoted by Leff, Siegfried Schultz, who wrote, all one had to do was go to one of the waiting rooms at the railroad stations in Eastern Berlin and listen to the Black Guards arriving or leaving for the front. So American journalists based in Germany would hear all these reports, and they would send them back to the United States. But this information, these reports were very few and far between in the mainstream press. If we move on to news from 1942, the information arrived in June, July, 1942. And the important thing, there was no high-level diplomatic note, which raises the question, why not? And then, of course, as I mentioned, there were three things happening in November. We have the new tranche of documents from Warsaw. We have refugees arriving in Palestine, bringing news of the camps, including Auschwitz. And we also have the State Department confirming the German policy of extermination. I think the key question then becomes, well, why did the Polish government in exile react with more robustly in December and November than they did in June, July? And I think the answer to that is somewhat tricky, it's a bit complicated, and it's to do with the internal politics of the Polish government in exile, the strength of the different factions of that government, especially the right at that point in time. But I also think maybe the note which the Polish government in exile received from the Catholic writer Zofia Kossak. Now this note, is very important. It describes what's happening to Jews, but at the same time, it includes a very anti-Semitic line in that note, where she says that the Jews were to remain our enemy. And I think the fact that this Catholic writer is speaking about what's happening to Jews while not disavowing this anti-Semitic aspect, I think that may have pulled some people from the right, the Polish right and the government exile, to say, actually, we need to take this a bit more seriously. And there's also the moral argument. Other groups are putting more pressure on governments in the West, Jewish groups particularly. And I think there's a political argument for the Polish government to act more robustly in November and December than they did in June, July, simply because of the variety of sources about the information. My general conclusion would be to your question is, it's not the evidence that is instrumental in putting this shift. It's essentially a political struggle and a moral struggle which was internal to the situation in both London and in the US. So evidence, and I think we've seen this, if we look at any recent genocide as well, over the last 70, 80 years, it rarely is the lack of evidence which precipitates action. It's always activists who are able to make the moral argument, and it's about political actors being able to put the political pressure on people who can make decisions to do something. Evidence is necessary, but by itself is insufficient. I will conclude on that particular question.
Perhaps just to follow up then, so you're emphasising that, that the Polish government in exile in London feels impelled towards the end of 1942 to a new degree to push now for the Allied declaration. And it does so partly because it wishes to explicitly distance itself from any accusations that it was not doing enough to highlight the particular fate of Jews. Was it also perhaps also because it knew that the British government, that was something that would also put them in a good light with the British government, or is that a cynical view? You've, in a sense, I'm getting from you the sense that it was an inherent, genuine impulse on the part of the Polish government in exile to do something.
I mean, there's a lot of internal politics from the Polish government in exile. I think there is this genuine push to recognise what's happening to Jews specifically. I don't think, I mean, the British Foreign Office was generally consistent in not wanting to publicise, not wanting to highlight the fate of Jews. I think, you know, if we look at the documentary evidence, you know, we have Frank Roberts reluctantly going forward. Frank Roberts is the head of the Central Department in the Foreign Office. You know, he is very reluctant, and most of the Foreign Office officials are reluctant with this UN declaration, but they go ahead with it. It becomes a moral argument, I think, for them. It's something we've got to do, but let's put it to one side as soon as it's done. And essentially, what we see in end of December 1942, and then through into January 1943, is a shift of the war narrative. Instead of, you know, reiterating, saying we need some action, we need some retaliation, you know, the Poles moved to talk about deportations of Poles in Zamość. The Foreign Office moves on to other aspects of the war. There is, you know, these leaflet drops. This is the Political Warfare Executive dropping some leaflets. So it's not complete inaction, but the focus and the opportunity to, you know, divest this information, to encourage more engagement with this question of what's happening to European Jews is essentially missed. And this becomes, you know, the last point, a high point of reporting on the Holocaust, until more or less we get to June 1944, when we have many, many reports from Poland arriving about the imminent execution of 3,000 Czech Jews. We have the Verbovetzer report coming in dribs and drabs from mid-June onwards. We have the Pope, we have the King of Sweden making statements. So, you know, if we look at how the narrative of the Holocaust plays out in the Western media, there are three high points of reporting. June, July 1942, November, December 1942, and then again in June, beginning of July 1944. And the rest of that is not that reports and very good evidence is being delivered. It's continuous. These are regular reports, month in, month out. There are reports. It doesn't make it into the mainstream press. There is no real effort. I mean, there are groups in the United States and Great Britain trying to focus on it, but these are fairly marginal efforts.
I want to come back in a minute to the British government's attitudes and inaction. But I just, before I do that, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about that moment, November, December 42, because your opening scene for the lecture was Jewish representatives in the USA making representations to Roosevelt in the White House in December 42. We haven't heard much so far about Jewish organizations in Britain. I mean, I take your point that the Polish government in exile was a very important actor here, but I just wonder, is there anything more to be said about the activists from Jewish organizations in the UK who might have been also pressing, aware of the evidence of what was happening and pressing the government? Or are they more in the background, would you say?
As in the US, and there's been a massive debate in the United States amongst Holocaust scholars about Jewish responses, the response of people like Stephen Wise, the efforts of the Bergson group, and the slight conflict between those two groups. In Britain, there wasn't equivalent of the Bergson group, which are radically activist in trying to push this news. However, I think this draws attention to the difficulties of how Jewish leaderships, both in the US and in Britain, engage with people in authority, and it's essentially by intercession with high-level politicians and foreign office officials and so on. And I think what the Holocaust has shown in both Britain and the United States is the limits of intercession as a strategy. And obviously, one of the results of that limit is the emergence of the Bergson group in the United States. We're talking specifically about Britain. So when the Budd report arrives, the Board of Deputies hold a conference in the end of June, publicising the information. They have a big rally in end of October 1942 at the Albert Hall, which Sikorski speaks. He mentions some of the news from Poland. There was also meetings with the Minister of Information, right? And in my research, I found a number of these meetings, and generally, this may be surprising, but generally, the focus of the meetings between Jewish leadership, by that I mean the Board of Deputies, and the Minister of Information, Brendan Bracken. Brendan Bracken, if you don't know, was a very good friend of Winston Churchill. Bracken had an office in 10 Downing Street, so he's basically a very good person to speak to. In these meetings with Bracken, Jewish representatives tend to talk about anti-Semitism in Britain. And if they spoke about promulgating news of the Holocaust, it's not in the minutes which were recorded. So we conclude something about that. Maybe they didn't press it as hard as they could have. By the same token, the chief rabbi, when he spoke at the Albert Hall in October 1942, he draws attention to British censorship. In his speech, and I'll quote, "The British public could not show its underlying hatred of all bestiality if much of that bestiality was so curiously screened from public knowledge." Right? He is very clear that what's happening within Britain is a form of censorship, and the news is not getting out. There is another dynamic I think is happening within Jewish leadership circles in Britain. So if we think who was in Britain during the wartime, so you have refugees from Germany and Austria. You also have Polish Jews in London. The Polish Jews are very well informed. These are the people who have representatives on the Polish National Council. So they are getting all the information from the Polish Ministry of Interior. They received the reports, the periodic reports, which include information about the death camps and mass killings and so on. And they in turn pass it on to Joe Sang, who is himself a Polish Jew. And one of the things which the Polish Jewish Observer is concerned about is not receiving any advertising from the British Board of Deputies. So if you want to ensure that people are aware of what's happening in Poland specifically and support people trying to promulgate this news, you may think you might want to take out a few adverts in the Polish Observer. So in January 1943, Joe Sang has a meeting with the Secretary of the Board of Deputies and saying, come on, we need some adverts. So I think it's a very mixed. I think it's very hard for the British Jewish leadership to contend with rising domestic anti-Semitism. And I'm going to draw attention to how we know about domestic anti-Semitism. During the Second World War, British sentiment, social sentiment, was monitored by home intelligence reports. This was basically public opinion surveys. And just after the UN declaration of the 17th of December 1942, a home intelligence report looked at how the British people were feeling about Jews. And the response was, abroad, greatest sympathy. At home, they badly want controlling. So it gives you some idea of the tensions and the complications facing the British Jewish leadership. I think it was very difficult for them. Okay.
No, thanks very much. I want now to talk a little bit more, ask you a little bit more about the British government's actions, what the British government did with the information it received on the Holocaust, and that this question has two parts. Firstly, the steps that it took to inform the Germans. I mean, we've heard about the leaflets, but perhaps we can say a little bit more about that. And secondly, to inform the British public. So with regard to the Germans, how would we characterize these efforts to inform the German population about the Holocaust? We've got the Massenmord leaflet. It's also in the exhibition here. You can see both sides of the leaflet in the exhibition. And references to the BBC German service. Obviously, you know, there were important broadcasts to Germany, which were picked up, as we know, by individuals who kept diaries. Anna Haag is an example we have in the exhibition. There were Thomas Mann's broadcasts and so on. So we can see that something was done, and it's very impressive how many millions of those Massenmord leaflets were in fact dropped. I mean, I think it's a very strikingly high number. But overall, if you were to sort of step back and say, okay, should we see these efforts as extensive, impressive, or should we see them as perhaps more tokenistic, rather lacking in impetus and rather short-lived?
I would generally err towards the second characterization. If we look at BBC broadcasts, news of the Holocaust were broadcast on all the European channels, so the Polish service, the German service, Hungarian service. And prior to broadcasting any news about atrocities, there were always policy debates and broadcasting debates. And this took two forms, but mainly it was discussed within the political warfare executive about how particular news should be articulated and what the goal was. And as I mentioned in my talk, it was to, you know, if it can provoke a guilt response. And one of the reasons why a great number of the BBC broadcasts were on the German women's program, it was trying to elicit a particular guilt response. At the same time, I think Foreign Office officials were concerned that the efforts about publicizing the Holocaust to Germany could not be captured by German propagandists, i.e. Britain was fighting the war on behalf of the Jews. They're sensitive to that particular claim. So we have numerous broadcasts to Germany. We have the leaflet drops. And if we look at when it really mattered, really when something was possible, and when I'm talking about April 1944, broadcast to Hungary, the advice to the station was actually compiled by a historian, Elmer McCartney, the great Hungarian, British Hungarian historian. And he sought to marginalize news of what was happening to Jews. I mean, it's pretty clear. And at the time, you know, British broadcasts, BBC broadcasts were being monitored. And there was a monitoring station in Stockholm. And in, I think it's April, early May, the monitoring station reported back to London saying, why is so much of these atrocities being screened from the public at this time? So, you know, even at the time, people were critical of the output. And I think, in hindsight, you know, when we recognize and understand that the probable destination of Hungarian Jews was clear, I think the efforts and the broadcasts during that period weren't particularly great. More could have been done in terms of informing both Hungarians and occupying Germans, and so on and so forth. But having said that, we have to recognize the challenges and the, to use a euphemism, the fog of war as well. So I will you know, taper my criticisms a little bit.
I guess just to follow up again on the screening of news to the British public, again, I sort of want to reiterate that important point you make about there were sort of windows where there was a burst of information, summer of 1942, November, December 1942, and then summer 1944. But apart from that, a great deal of covering up or downplaying or marginalizing. And I just wonder, could you say a little bit more about actually how this censorship operated? Was it an unspoken, did newspaper editors simply understand without having been told that the Foreign Office wished these matters not to be on the front page? Or do we get sort of newspaper editors being hauled in and sort of saying, didn't you know, do you get it? I just wonder quite how discreet or explicit or forceful this sort of act of censorship was. And just again, coupled to that, you've mentioned important reasons for this sort of shielding of the public by the, you know, the Home Office was worried about the rise of anti-Semitism, you know, which existed, and the Foreign Office particularly about Palestine, and any pressure to increase the quotas of Jews entering Palestine, absolutely keeping a lid on that. I mean, would you weight those factors at all? Was one factor perhaps more important at one time or another, or were they both very important? Plus, obviously, the argument all the time that no resources must be wasted on anything other than winning the war. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, let's just talk a little bit about how information was controlled. So, information arrived in Britain in different ways. News sent along the news wires, so for example from American journalists, all those news items through press agencies arrived at one single point, which is the press agency in London. And at that point, information was censored. Most of its censoring is to do with war information. But that is a key nodal in the censorship regime. Information about atrocities was censored through advice. So Brendan Bracken had meetings with newspaper editors and saying, you know, this is how we want atrocities to be narrated. We want to maintain the British morale. These are the other issues at hand. We want to avoid, as we've mentioned, domestic anti-Semitism. There's also, you know, the own prejudices of newspaper editors. At the same time, one or two newspapers went off script from time to time, and you see this in some of the Foreign Office reporting, Foreign Office documents. about a couple of newspapers, but nothing really systematic about the Holocaust that's being published during those intervals. Occasional stories, tucked away, 1 line, 2 lines, on page 17. You really have to find some of these stories about the Holocaust in British newspapers. And to be fair to Martin Gilbert, I'm very critical of his book, Auschwitz and the Allies, whose main thesis is obviously wrong. But when he was writing, we didn't have search engines like we have today. You'd have to do it the old school fashion of going through all the newspapers page by page, and one can be forgiven for missing a tiny little article on some important event in a camp or something and so forth. If we think about the BBC Home Service had the same sort of censorship regime as newspapers, which is essentially advisory, but the BBC conformed. The Foreign Service, the European Service, the control was more direct. The head of the service was Yvonne Kirkpatrick. Yvonne Kirkpatrick was a senior Foreign Office official, seconded to the BBC for the duration of the war, and he maintained tight control. News reports were received and went through the political warfare executive, and the angle and the policy angle and the information angle of what was reported to different publics was pre-agreed in these meetings by leading figures of the PWE, Political Warfare Executive. And in terms of authoritative information, so we think about papers of records. In the United States, it's the New York Times. In Britain, you have the Times. So people reading the Times would have certain information. They think this is the most important, the most faithful, the most authentic information. But for the British leadership, the ruling class, 500 leading people in Britain, they'd also receive a document written by the Foreign Office entitled the Weekly Political Intelligence Summary. And this summary rarely spoke about the Holocaust. And there's only one occasion that gassing of Jews is mentioned in its entire duration for the entire war. And that's probably a mistake because the editorial board changed in May 1943. And so what you have here is the leading figures in Britain receiving information which is the authoritative story of the war. Then you have the leading newspapers which are also marginalizing news of the Holocaust. Then you have maybe a few tabloids like the Daily Mirror which publish a little bit more on the Holocaust. And then below that, in a supplement to the East London, City and East London newspaper, you have the whole story. And then questions emerge, well, what's the authentic story? And you can see how doubt is built into the system of knowledge, the system of information. So you don't really need a very strict, ostentatious censorship regime like you'd have in a communist state, so you can't write that, you can't write that. People were doing it automatically. It'd been internalized. And indeed, there was a meeting between some leading figures, Eden, Bracken, and some other people. I think it was in 1941, where they articulate the benefits of a voluntary censorship regime, which is essentially people using their common sense. So if we were, using like Gramsci or something, we're talking about hegemonic ideology. And I think this is what we see during this period of time. We see common sense of not reporting the Holocaust, just taking over as an ideology within newspaper editors, newspaper reporters, and so on and so forth. So it's so difficult for activists like Shmuel Ziegerboim, for Eleanor Rathbone, for Victor Gollancz, for the people who were desperately trying to get this news out there to actually make any impact whatsoever. So thanks. That's my response to that question.
I've got a few more questions, but I think I'll limit myself just to one more, and perhaps in the general discussion we can say a little bit more about the pressure for war crimes trials. I think that's an important part of what you've been talking about, but I'd like to really just finish with a question about, it's a counterfactual really, but could you comment on what you think might have been different, what could have been achieved if the British government in particular had not been so restrictive and censored emerging evidence on the Holocaust as it was still continuing, perhaps above all in March, April 1944. What could have been different? And I ask that as a British person who's read in the last few weeks your book and other things about this whole topic, and felt, I suppose, a sense of, well, perhaps shock, actually, and shame about what the British government was doing. Perhaps that's an excessive reaction, but it's how I did react, and perhaps how other British people might react if they knew more about it or grasped it more clearly. Perhaps that sort of consciousness is growing in Britain now. Perhaps you'd like to say a bit about that, but a critical view of British government policy during the war. But anyway, perhaps on the question of what might have been different.
I think when we get to the point where there's an opportunity for military intervention, and we're really talking about when it's possible for the Allies, the Western Allies, to reach or fly to and bomb certain camps. And this opportunity emerges, I guess, military historians gravitate to around April 1944. And I think, you know, when we think about the reporting and the marginalization of the Holocaust in reporting, we've got to bear in mind that this has a cost. And this cost is the British people weren't prepared for actions other than purely military objectives. And I think Hungarian Jews, in a different type of information regime, could have been prioritized. That's one thing. I think, you know, better reporting all the way through would lead to a sentiment amongst populations that we can't allow Hungarian Jews to be deported like other populations were deported to the camps. By the same token, I think a freer reporting regime and more respect for Europe's Jewish populations would have changed the dynamics within the Polish government exile to some extent. And when you get to 1944, there's only one significant Jewish population left, and that's in Łódź, right? And the Jews of Łódź are deported to Auschwitz in July and August 1944. And my personal sentiment, this is my personal opinion, and many people disagree. I think in the right environment, pressure on the Polish government, or Polish government responding to the right environment, you would have seen some actions to at least try to save those thousands of Jews who were taken in July and August 44 to Auschwitz. And that would have been, you know, an important symbolic event, I would have thought. And I think it's a shame that military resources were then shifted to Warsaw for a voluntary uprising, which could have been avoided. I mean, that's a controversial opinion, but you know, I think if we get to the end of the war, where it's clear that Germany are going to lose, what are your objectives? You're going to win the war, it's going to be difficult, but there are civilian populations which can be saved. And I think, to some extent, those two populations, maybe. I mean, this is counterfactual, you know, it's not really critical, and I'm sure everyone in this room has got an opinion about different choices at different points in time. But, you know, I think those are the two things which I think preoccupy me a bit more than others.